The shift to the educational focus from content to learning outcomes. At the end of this lesson, we have the expected learning outcomes. Number one, explain three outstanding characteristics of outcome-based education. Number two, distinguish among institutional outcomes, program outcomes, course outcomes, and learning outcomes. Number three, distinguish between immediate outcomes and deferred outcomes. Number four, differentiate educational objectives from learning outcomes. And number five, we have to formulate learning outcomes based on the given educational objectives. So to start, what is education? So education came from the word educare or educere, which means to draw out. So before, we believe that education is a pouring in process wherein the teacher was the giver of the knowledge and the students was the recipient. So everything is taught by the teacher. All the knowledge that the student will learn inside the classroom is taken from the teacher. That is the education um, system before. So it followed that the focus of instruction was content and the subject matter. But this time, as our education system is developing, and with the advent of different factors, let's say, for example, technology, the teacher sees to be the sole source of knowledge. So students were surrounded with various sources of facts and information that is already accessible with or using the technology. So all of you can use Google, you can learn a lot from Google, from YouTube, and whatever source of information. Now, what is the role of the teacher? The teacher has become already the facilitator of knowledge who will assist the organization, the interpretation, and the validation of acquired facts and information. Because not all the information and the knowledge that you will gather in the internet or wherever it is, that is still to be validated or to be verified. Kaya dili na siya tanan makita ninyo sa Google is sakto. Because all of us also can input information on the internet. So I can input wrong information from the internet to the internet. You also, so every one of us. So it needs filtration, organization, interpretation, and validation of facts and information. So, the change in educational perspective called outcomes based education has three main characteristics. We have here it is student centered, it is faculty driven, and it is meaningful. When we say student centered, it places the students at the center of the process by focusing on the student learning outcomes. It also implies that the student is mainly responsible of their own learning. So the next one here is the faculty driven. So it encouraged the faculty responsibility for teaching, assessing program outcomes, and motivating participation from the students. And as it is meaningful, that is, it provides data to guide the teacher in making valid and continuing improvement in instruction and assessment activities. So to implement outcomes-based education on the subject or course, the following procedure is recommended. We have here three procedures. Number one, identification of the educational objectives of the subject or course. So educational objectives are the broad goals that the subject expects to achieve. So this is what we are setting before we start our class or our plan for our class. So they define in general terms the knowledge, the skills, and attitudes that the teacher will help the students to attain. Subjectives are stated from the point of view of the teachers, such as to develop, to provide, to enhance, to inculcate, or some more. So, educational objectives is different from learning outcomes. So, as a teacher, educational objective is what we set for ourselves, for us to, or so that we will know what to teach. But this time, for the second step is the learning outcomes. Learning outcomes is what you set to your students. So listing of learning outcomes specified for each subject or course objective. So since course objectives are broadly stated, they do not provide detailed guide to be teachable and measurable. So learning outcomes are stated as concrete active active verbs such as to demonstrate, to explain, to differentiate, to illustrate, and some other verbs that we can see or we can observe after the lesson. So a good source of learning outcomes is the taxonomy of educational object educational objectives by Benjamin Bloom. So it's called the Bloom's taxonomy of educational objectives. So it is grouped into three. We have here cognitive, psychomotor, and affective. So we will differentiate the three. So when we say cognitive, it is also called the knowledge. So it refers to the mental skills such as remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and synthesizing or creating. So the learning outcomes that you have to set in the cognitive is focusing on the mental skills. The next here is the psychomotor. So it is referred to the skills. So physical skills. So it includes manual or physical skills which proceed from mental activities and range from the simplest to the complex, such as observing, imitating, practicing, adapting, and innovating. So it's somehow a process. So let's say going back to cognitive is about learning or accommodating the information in your mentally. So to show your learning mentally, we will use the psychomotor skills. So by observing, learning by observing. Next is by imitating or following the steps. Next is practicing. So you practice by yourself. Next is adapting, meaning you were able to naturally perform or easily perform because you have adapted the skill. And the last one is creating something new out of those skill, and that is called innovating. The next one is the affective. So it's also known as the attitude. Attitude refers to growth in feelings or emotions from the simplest behavior to the most complex, such as receiving, responding, valuing. Next is organizing and internalizing. So when we say affective, it's from your attitude. It's your attitude or how you respond to something, to, to a stimuli. So it refers to your emotion. So how will you receive things or how will you receive information? Will you receive it in a positive way or in a negative way? So next is how will you respond after receiving? Will you do such thing or not? Will you took care of it or not? The next one is value. How you value things. Will you give value or will you give importance to things? Next is organizing. So we say organizing, how will you put things together? Will you put the most important one first or the less important one? So that's how you value and organize. And the last one is internalizing. So this is the time that you internalize and you think. You are doing metacognition, thinking about how you think. So that is the affective domain of Bloom's taxonomy of educational objectives. So that those are our categories in setting the learning outcomes. The third one is drafting outcomes assessment procedure. So this procedure will enable the teacher to determine the degree to which the students are attaining the desired learning outcomes. It identifies for every outcome the data that will be gathered, which will guide the selection of the assessment tools to be used and at what point assessment will be done. Those are the steps in implementing OBE in the subject.